So let's go over what we're going to cover in this module. Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about control statements in general. There's basically three types of control statements, and I'm going to introduce those three types to you so you can understand from a high level what kinds of control statements can exist. Then we're going to go down and we're going to cover each of the particular types of control statements that exist in Java. First, we'll look at the if and else statement, which is a basic way to branch your code based on a Boolean condition. Then we'll get into the switch statement, which is a way to do almost the same thing as an if and else, but is a lot cleaner when you have a series of conditions that you want to check and do something based on that condition. Then we'll look at our first loop, which is the for loop, which is a loop that allows us to increment a counter while we're looping through some section in our code. And then we'll look at the for each loop, which is another special kind of loop, which makes it very easy for us to do a loop and to loop through things in a container or in some kind of collection. Then we'll look at the while loop, which is just a very simple and basic loop that allows us to loop until some condition is met. And then finally, we'll look at the break and continue statements, which are used to get us out of a loop early, either by breaking out of the loop entirely or continuing to the next iteration of that loop. Control statements are a very important part of any programming language. Without control statements, there isn't much that we'd be able to actually do in our programs. Control statements allow us to be able to branch to different parts of the code, to be able to loop through the code, and to be able to jump to different areas of the code. Without these kinds of statements, our code would basically just run from start to finish without ever returning back up or looping or choosing a different path. So the basic idea behind a control statement is that it allows us to control the flow or the execution of our code. And control statements can basically be divided into three main types, and we're going to cover some of each one of these types in the rest of this module. The first type that we're going to cover is conditional statements. And conditional statements can be thought of as statements that allow the code to branch or to choose a different path. We're going to cover two types of conditional statements. One is the if and else statement, and the other is the switch. And both of these statements we'll see will allow us to evaluate some kind of condition and then choose a code path to take based on the value of that condition. The next type of control statement that we're going to look at is an iterative control statement. An iterative control statement is basically just a loop. And we're going to look at several different kinds of loops in Java and see how we can construct the loops and how we can both enter and exit the loops. The final kind of control statement is a jumping statement, and we've already covered one of these so far. The return statement, when we looked at methods, is an example of a jumping statement, and that's because it jumps from one location of the code to another location of the code. There's two others that we're going to cover here, and they're both related to loops, which is the continue and the break statement. And we're going to use these statements in order to exit a loop early or to go to the next iteration of a loop early. The first control statement that we're going to look at in Java is the if and else statement. This is one of the most basic statements that we can use in order to branch our code in some way or to execute some conditional logic. So I've got our printer class open here from our Hello World project, and we are going to modify this so that we can do something useful based on the state. If you remember, we had created our printer, and we even created a constructor so that we could create a new printer, set whether or not it's on or off, and set its model number in the constructor. And then we, of course, printed out the value of our printer. And if I run this right now, we can see that it prints out true because it's on, and then the model number. But let's try and do something more useful than that. Instead, let's make it so that this print statement will tell us the model number and then whether or not the printer is on. So right now, we can't really do that very well without some kind of a conditional statement. What we really want to do is we want to say if the printer is on, then print the model number and is on, so that we can say this model number is on. We don't have a way to do that without using a kind of statement that we're going to see now, which is the if statement. So let's go ahead and comment out these print line statements. And let's change this so that we're now going to make it so that if the printer is on, then we want to say the model number, and then that the printer's on. So the way that we do that is we just use if, and then what goes in these parentheses has to evaluate to true or false. So it has to be Boolean. We could just put the word true here, and this would evaluate to true. We could put false there, it would evaluate to false. Or we can put any kind of statement that's going to result in a true or false there, or a variable that's a Boolean type. In this case, what we're going to check here is this is on variable. So we can check if is on, and then we can do something here. Now, we can execute one statement after this check, the if condition is true, or we can use a block here and execute multiple statements, as many as we want. In this case, we're just going to need one statement, but I'm going to go ahead and use a block here. A lot of people like to use blocks and if statements because if you add more statements to them, you don't accidentally create a new statement on another line that doesn't get executed as part of this if. So in this case, let's check if the printer's on. Let's do system.out.println, and then we'll print the model number plus is on. So now we're going to check to see if the printer's on when this is called, and if it is, then we're actually going to print something out. And if it's not on, we're not actually going to print anything out at all. So let's go ahead and test this out and see how this works. So I'll go to our hello world, and we'll run this. And you can see it's printed out the model number, which is my printer, is on. And if we created a printer that was not on, and then we ran this, you can see there's no output. It didn't print anything. So the basic syntax of an if statement is very simple. We just say if, we check our condition, and then we put what we want to do if the condition is met, either in a block following it or the very next statement. We could have also written this like this without the block statement, and that would have worked as well. Now, one thing that we might want to be able to do is to have another piece of code execute if the printer is not on, if this condition evaluates to false. And we can use an else statement to achieve that. So in this case, all we have to do is you already have to have an if statement. You can put your code to execute if the if statement is true in a block, if you want, or not. And then you need to put an else statement, and you can put the code to execute in a block or not there as well. Now what will happen is, if this condition evaluates to true, what is in the if statement, or the if block, will execute, and if it evaluates to false, what's in the else will execute. So we can take this same system out print line, and then in this case, let's print is off. And I just wanted to say something here about these strings here. Generally, you don't want to concatenate strings by using this plus symbol in Java. There's some better ways to do this. We'll probably cover this a little bit later on, but just so if you're looking at this and saying, oh, can't you format that string? If you know what I'm talking about when I talk about a string formatter, then go ahead and use a string formatter in Java. But if you don't, if you're just starting out, I just want to show you the if and else statement, and I want to keep things as simple as possible. So that's why I'm just using the plus, because I think the plus is a lot easier for people to understand when they're first learning a programming language. So now let's see what this code will do when the printer is off and when the printer is on. So I'll save this file. We'll go ahead and we'll run. And right now the printer is off, so we get my printer is off. And if we set this to true, then you should see that it's now saying that it's on. So that's it. That's the if. The next kind of control statement that we're going to look at is a switch statement. And a switch statement is a statement that allows us to evaluate the value of some variable or some statement, some expression, and based on that value, do different things for different values. So a good example of a way that we can test this is we can have our print statement print a certain number of copies, and based on that number of copies we're going to print out the model number and then is on or off that many times. So let's go ahead and modify our print statement so that it'll take in a number of copies. So we'll put int copies here, and this will be the number of copies, and then we can use a switch statement by calling switch, and then what we want to switch on. We want to switch on the number of copies, and then what we'll do now is inside of our block here, we're going to provide cases for the different cases that could exist. So case of 0, we can do something. And for each one of these case statements, we need to provide a way to get out of this, either to return or break, so that we don't fall through. Because a switch statement, what will happen is, if we have a case 0 and a case 1 here, if our number of copies that comes in is 0, it's going to execute the code that we put after this case 0, and then it's going to go right on to case 1. It basically falls through in Java. So this can be useful if we want to utilize this in a switch statement, but if not, we can use this break statement, which we'll cover a little bit more in detail later when we get into loops. But for now, we can just know that you'll need to put a break statement after each case if you don't want it to fall through. So I've got a case 0 and a case 1 here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put after this case what I want to happen in the code. So we're going to do something that's a little inefficient here for now, and then we're going to make it more efficient when we get into loops. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put our code that prints here, but I'm going to put this only for the case of 1. So in the case of 1, then we'll print this statement once, either the on or the off. In the case of 0, we're not going to do anything. Let's go ahead and add another case here. I'm going to add a case of 2. If the copies amount is 2, then we're going to print this twice. And if it's off, we'll print this twice. And again, this is very inefficient what we're doing here, but I just want to demonstrate to you how the case works and then show you how a loop will help to make this code a lot cleaner later on. Right now we're programming without a loop, and that's why this is going to be a little bit messy here. The other thing that you can do with a switch statement is you can have a default case. So if it doesn't match 0 or 1 or 2, then we can choose to use the keyword default, and this is a special case. This default case is going to get hit if it doesn't match any of the cases that are here. So if our copies is passed in as a 3, it's not going to hit 0, it's not going to hit 1, it's not going to hit 2, it's going to hit the default here. In this case, we're going to print out number of copies is not supported. So if anyone picks a number greater than 2, we're just not going to be able to print that out. We're just going to say that it's not supported. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. We'll have to go in and we'll have to modify our call to print because we've required a parameter now. If you remember, we've added this copies parameter. So let's make a copies of 0 and see what happens. I'll run this and you can see nothing has happened because what has occurred here is we passed in a 0 here. We switched on copies, which was 0. And because it was 0, it went to this case 0, and it did nothing. It just broke out of the switch statement. So now let's try print 1 for 1 copy. We get my printer is on because the printer is set to on. And what we can see has happened here is it switched on copies. Copies was 1. We have a case 1. It executed everything here until the break. Then it broke out. Let's go ahead and try print 2. And you can see it's printed, my printer is on twice. And that's because when we went into our switch, the copies was 2, it hit this case, it hit this is on statement, and then it simply printed out twice. And again, this is not very efficient because we're repeating a lot of code. We have a lot of code duplication here, and that's because we don't have the ability to use a loop because we haven't learned about that yet. But once we get to a loop, we're going to be able to clean that up. Now let's give a number that's greater than 2. Let's put 50 here and see what happens. You can see number of copies is not supported because it's hit this default case. And let's see what would happen if we took away one of these break statements. Let's say that you forgot on case 2 to put a break statement here. So let's delete this. Now we'll go back and we'll make it so that we try to print 2 copies. And we'll run this. And you can see it actually hit the statement for 2, but then it went right on and hit the default statement. It fell through. So it's very important to remember to put a break statement or some kind of return, something to stop it. Otherwise, it'll just fall all the way through. And sometimes the behavior you want, for example, if you wanted to do the same thing for, let's say, 1 and 5, we could actually do case 1, case 5 here, and you can see either 1 or 5 is going to execute this code right here. So I'll go ahead and switch this to a 5 now, and you can see that it still did what 1 had done before. So a switch statement basically lets you switch based on the value of some value, and if you're using Java 7, you can actually switch on a string. So you could put a string here and not just a number, but if you're using an earlier version of Java, it'll have to be an integer to switch on. And you can see here that we could make our numbers go up to any number up here, and we can provide cases for any number of values that we wanted to, and we always have this capability of creating this default case. And we don't need a break here on the default case because there's nothing for it to fall through. That we're going to look at in Java is the for statement. And this is not the simplest of loops, but it's perhaps one of the most common loops in Java. A for statement is a statement that allows you to loop through a series of statements or execute some code a number of times, and in that process it allows you to keep track of a counter or to do some action on every loop. So let me show you a simple example of a for statement, and what we're going to do is we're going to simplify this code. We're going to do a little bit of what's called refactoring here, and this code right now is a mess because it's really duplicating a lot of stuff here. We see that we have the same line kind of printed out in these different places, and when we want a case for printing one copy, we do one of these statements, and when we have the case for 2, we just repeat it, and that's really inefficient, and it's really copying a lot of code. And so when this changes, if we wanted to make a case 3, we'd have to have 3 of these print lines, and that's really just not a good way to go. But with a loop, we can simplify this. So I'm going to create a loop up here. We'll go ahead and delete these statements. Now I'm going to show you how we can use a for loop. So the syntax of a for loop is you use for here, and then you have some parentheses. And there's 3 things that go into the parentheses, and they are separated by 2 semicolons here. So I'm going to put these semicolons in place. And I'm just going to put what each one of these is. So this first section here is going to be an initializer. The second section here is going to be the condition, and the third one is going to be an increment. So the idea here with a for loop is you need to initialize some variables or some kind of count. You check it. Every loop, it's going to check this condition and see if this condition still evaluates to true. If it doesn't, it's going to quit looping. And then you want to be able to increment. You want to be able to do something that changes the condition so that it will eventually end. So let's go ahead and see an example of this. So I'm going to use integer I here. I can declare a variable right inside this for loop. So I've declared a variable called I, and I is commonly used for a counter. You could use a name like count, and that's a little bit more descriptive, but for this example I'm going to use I to save a little bit of space here and make it easier to read. So here I've declared my variable I, I've set its count to 0, and we're going to loop until I is less than the number of copies. And then I have another semicolon here, and then every time we loop, we're going to use this I++. And if you remember, this I++ is the same thing as saying I equals I plus 1. What we're going to do is we're going to increment I every time. Now the same thing as with an if statement, we could just use one single line here, or we can use a block. Commonly in a loop you're going to use a block, and everything that's in this block is going to get executed every iteration of the loop, or every time this loop goes around. So right now, if we just looked at this structure here of this for loop that we have, we're going to start at 0. It's going to check and see, is I, which is start at 0, less than the number of copies? If it is, then it's going to increment I, and then it's going to go on and do what's in this loop. So, for example, if we put in a copies of 2, I is going to start at 0. I is going to be less than 2. 0 is less than 2. So then I is going to become 1. Then it's going to do whatever in here. And now we have an I equal to 1. It's not going to re-execute this initialization statement. Now it's just going to check this value. 1 is less than 2. So we're going to get I++, which is going to make it 2. Then we're going to execute what's in this loop. And now, is 2 less than 2? It's not, so we're done. So it's going to execute that loop 2 times. So let's actually change our code to make use of this, because what we're doing in our print method here is we're trying to print the number of copies. We want to print this statement, is on or is off, however many times that's passed in here. And we only supported 1 or 2 or the default, for the default we said number of copies is not supported because we couldn't really support 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It would have been a lot of coding to write all that code, and we could never have supported 1,000. It would have been way too much typing in order to support that much. But using a loop, we can support pretty much any number of copies. So what we'll do here is we'll take this whole if statement and we'll just move it inside this loop. So now what we're going to do is, however many copies there are, is how many times we're going to go through this loop, and each time we're going to print either the model number and then either on or off. So we'll take out this old switch code, and you can see how much code that we've been able to eliminate just by getting rid of that switch statement and replacing it with a loop. This loop is going to be a lot more efficient. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. And we'll go ahead and leave this 5. We'll print 5 times. You can see here it's printed 5 times. If I put a 1 in, it's only going to print once. If I put in 0, it won't print any times. It completely skipped it. And I could even put in 10 here, and it will work as well. You can see there's 10. So what's happened here? What happened when we put in 10? Well, we had 10 get passed in, it was set to copies, and we looped from 0 to 10. And this is one of those things that always confused me when I was first starting out programming, is how to initialize the for loop and how to know how many copies I want to do. It starts at 0, or do I start at 1? The best thing to do is just to kind of memorize